Hi everyone, I'm here with Sam Hodges, the co-founder and chairman of Funding Circle. Sam is absolutely caring, fun, loving person. Everybody loves him so much.
It's very kind.
And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to ask you questions on a more personal level.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
Of course, thank you so much for coming here. And learn anything from you on a more personal, not necessarily the business level. And then just hear your experiences, ups and downs. So let's get right into it.
Sounds good.
My first question is, if you look back in your teenage years, before you dove right into the business world, what was your what was that era for you?
If I were to be really honest, I would say that I was a pretty dorky teenager. I think many of us probably were, if we were to be really honest about it. But at the same time, I had a really strong affinity for team sports. And aside, I'd worked a lot. I started bussing tables when I was 14 or 15. I think my first kind of real job for a summer was selling knives for Cutco. And so I think early on I had a sense that it was important to kind of find your way in the world and make sure you could financially support yourself. So spent a lot of time obviously being bookish and kind of nerdy, spent a lot of time playing sports, and then worked a good bit as a teenager.
That's awesome. So were you actually selling knives door to door?
So the way I was Vector marketing. Many people probably have either bought knives from Vector or at least heard the pitch. It's a multi-level marketing scheme, right? Mm-hmm. And the way it worked was largely through referrals. So you'd start with your friends and family friends, and then you'd ask people for a referral, and you just work your way through the network. And it was really interesting to see most salespeople only made it kind of one layer out, right? Meaning they're only really comfortable going and making an ask to people they knew directly. For me, actually, that was the most awkward part, right? Going to people, friends and family, and saying, "Hey, do you want to buy these knives?" They're really good knives. I actually still have mine, believe it or not. 20-something years later.
Helps when you believe it.
But what I realized was actually, once I was talking to people I didn't necessarily know, I kind of enjoyed selling, and so that was for me, that was an important early realization. Is sales can be fun.
Nice. So you knew right away that you wanted to do something and push yourself even when you were pretty early in the
I would say that I was an ambitious teenager, but I was also pretty undirected in terms of where that ambition was going. And if anything, I actually, through most of college, I would say that the path that I was on would be to become an academic. I did a couple of research internships while I was in college, and probably at least partway through my junior year, my plan was go get a PhD and follow that track. Further back. I come from a family of scientists. My mom was a science writer, and a nonprofit manager. My dad was and still is a physicist. His parents are scientists. I have a lot of kind of scientists, doctors, engineers in the family. And so, if anything, I'm now kind of a black sheep, so to speak, as an entrepreneur, business person.
Awesome, I see. Did they encourage you to get into the science and engineering?
They did, and I think my parents are still somewhat regretful of the fact I'm not a scientist, a scientist of some sort. So, parents, if you're listening, I'm sorry.
That's great. So at which point did you actually know that you wanted to build something of your own? Not just maybe work in sales, but more of building your own little baby, whatever it could be, whether it's a business or some other idea.
Definitely. I would say that there were two kind of linked moments of realization. The first was kind of late in college. I did an internship at a management consulting firm and really enjoyed it. I just found the content to be really interesting. I liked the pressure, kind of the analytical rigor. I liked the results orientation. Those are things that I really gravitated toward. And so going into my senior year of college, I kind of made a decision that I was going to forego the academic route and instead try my hand as a business person, which, if I were to be really honest about it, as a 20 or 21-year-old, I had no idea what that meant, right? Yeah. Coming out of my college, it's kind of like you went to med school, you went to law school, maybe you joined a nonprofit, or maybe you went to work in investment banking or consulting. Mm-hmm. And there was literally very little visibility as to what those paths entailed. Yeah. And so I kind of took a leap ended up joining a boutique strategy consulting firm at the beginning of my career called Katzenbach Partners, which was a really wonderful experience. It was great training, really wonderful group of people, and spent the first about 2.5 years of my career there. And I would say the second realization, the first being I wanted to do something in the business, the second realization I had was I was really drawn to and very passionate about building things. One of the opportunities I had while I was at Katzenbach, and I just kind of happened into it, was the opportunity to work with our software development team actually to build out a new survey product, which we used to in several of our client engagements. And so, pretty early on in my career, I had the opportunity to build something, and it was a very mini little business. It didn't account for much in terms of the bottom line, certainly, but it was I built a small business internally, and that was very exciting for me.
Right.
And so that made me realize that maybe instead of going and working with very large corporations or serving as an advisor to companies, instead actually going and building stuff as an entrepreneur, an entrepreneurial operator, could be a really attractive path, and kind of went from there.
How old were you at that time?
That must have been 23-ish.
23.
Yeah, 23, 24.
Wow.
No, it took me a while from there to actually, build up the chutzpah to actually launch something. But I think from about 23, I was set on doing something.
Great. And so what were the steps that you took from like that moment at 23? And you're like, all right, I've got to do something. And then what were the actual steps you took until you started?
So my first step was actually kind of an interesting and sideways one. I followed a colleague, someone who's still a very good friend of mine, to start up a company. And funnily, about 3 weeks after I joined that company, their main funder pulled out, and we sold the business. And so my first kind of entrepreneurial foray, which was joining someone else's company, although admittedly one that had a great team, and the people who ran it were really very high quality, but it kind of gave me a taste of one of the ways that startup companies don't work out.
Right.
I ended up sticking around for a period of time and helping the CEO of that business kind of get things in order. And then I actually took some time off and kind of thought more deeply around, like, well, how did I join a company that so quickly kind of went through that event? And one of the things I realized was having the ability to see across many startup companies actually could be a really valuable experience. And so I was lucky and was able to talk my way into a job that at a fund that invested in a lot of early stage companies. So I ended up joining a large investment fund called Black Capital Management. I was part of the private direct investing team. We did a lot of venture capital and growth equity style investing. And basically the next step that I took from there was almost 2 years doing that role. Was involved in investing and helping build a number of businesses. Was very fortunate to kind of be taken under the wing of a very experienced entrepreneur, a guy at the time who was in his 60s and had built several multi-million-dollar businesses over the course of his career, and learned a tremendous amount kind of just watching him and learning from him, as well as the other entrepreneurs in our portfolio. And then the next step I took was moving into an operating role with one of the companies we invested in, which was a really interesting company called Second Market, which was a technology-enabled marketplace for liquid financial assets. And my timing there was just very fortuitous because I was there right during the financial crisis. And that was a moment where pretty much every financial asset was illiquid. So there was a lot of opportunity for us at Second Market. And again, I was very fortunate to kind of train the knee of a very good entrepreneur, Barry Silbert, who's someone who I consider a good friend, and it's been really exciting to watch his career subsequently. So anyway, long story short, I kind of took a number of steps where I was learning and kind of learning by absorption before I ultimately decided to go and launch my own thing.
Wonderful. So it means like you just took one step that led you to sort of another step, and then within it you learned so much from people who already have that experience, rather than just going out in the world and stumbling and falling by yourself.
I think that there are plenty of successful entrepreneurs who jump directly into what they're going to do. My experience was that having worked in a couple of different startup organizations and also worked as an investor looking at those startup organizations, when it finally came time for me to kind of take my turn, I had a broader toolkit, and with benefit of hindsight, maybe a slightly higher chances of success, right? There are so many things that can go wrong in building a company, and so many decisions you make early, kind of stick around and continue to persist over the course of the organization that you build. And so even if in a small way, getting a little bit of pattern recognition before you take the leap that's something I encourage most people to do.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind sharing some of those insights, like just at least a few that kind of stick out to you, some of the things that we should avoid doing early, and then some things that just really stand out as things you should do or you shouldn't do.
For sure. I mean, so many lessons, right? And you can, when I think about building a company, there are obviously a couple of major elements you have to think about, right? There's the product and the product strategy. What's the pain point you're solving? How are you going to solve that problem? What mix of kind of technology or service are you going to deliver? There obviously is the go-to-market plan. How do you go out and get to market? There's all the operational infrastructure underneath that. There's all the people and organizational stuff. And then, to the extent that it's a regulated business, and a lot of my experience has been on the regulated side, how do you make sure from a regulatory and compliance and operational risk perspective, everything holds together as well and you end up not blowing up? If I were to try to distill a couple of major lessons, number one I'd say is, if anything, start with your go-to-market plan, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Because I think a lot of people, when they think about kind of starting something, they start with a very product-led perspective. My experience has been that more often than not, what will prevent a company from becoming successful or ultimately cause its untimely demise is lack of insight in terms of how you actually are going to get to market. Is it going to be through partnerships? Is it going to be direct? If it's direct, how are you going to do demand generation, right? Is it going to be sales-led? Is it going to be more marketing-led? Are you going to have to support your customer through fulfillment? Is it an enterprise solution, mid-market, or SMB? Or is it a direct-to-consumer type approach? And across all of those, there are a lot of different, now well-honed techniques you can use to make the business effective. But I do think that having a really strong angle on why do you have an advantage with respect to what I think of as distribution, kind of your go-to-market, I think you can get really crisp on that. That increases your chance of success pretty importantly. The other big lesson that I would distill is take your hiring decisions very seriously, right? Bad hires end up costing you in ways that are almost impossible to imagine at the outset. And the amount of churn and emotional distress, not to mention real business problems that come from making bad hires, can be pretty harmful, particularly when a company is very small.
Right, and especially in the beginning,
Right. Once you're larger, you can afford to make more mistakes. But I do think that having and it's not just a high bar thing, right? I think a lot of people are like, have a high bar for hiring. Like, what does that mean? Right? When I think about it, it's people who are very values aligned with what you're trying to do and have the right skills for the roles you're putting them in. There are lots of great people out there, lots of people with tremendous skills. But if you take an awesome person and put them into a role where they don't have the skills to be successful, that's shame on you. It's not shame on them.
Right.
And so trying to be really thoughtful about that early on, really, really key. And by the way, my experience has been if you can get it right 70 or 80% of the time, you're doing great. You're never going to get it 100% of the way there.
Right. So who was your first either like co-founder or someone who you started this with, or were you by yourself?
So the entity that it eventually became Funding Circle USA, I had a co-founder with. He was a business school classmate and still a good friend. And it was an idea that we had jointly developed. He brought a lot of insight on small business ownership. He'd built out a gym business that I was an investor in and kind of helped see through. And ultimately, the insight that I brought to bear was from my experience at Second Market, which is you can use a marketplace-driven model to facilitate capital formation and get basically investors to put investments or put money to work in investments that are more non-traditional. And so the ultimate kind of thesis was, hey, what if we create this marketplace thing that connects small business borrowers on the one hand with alternative sources of capital on the other? And that conversation was for us, summer 2011, and here we are, 7+ years later.
Great. And so when you just had this idea, it sounds great on paper, and there's lots of great ideas. What's your strategy to actually validate whether, of course, like there's one or two people who it sounds really great, but then what do you actually do to make sure that this is a really solid idea that you should pursue and invest a lot of money and time into?
It's a great question. What I would say is it's not an all or nothing decision. The reality is most businesses evolve quite a bit between initial conception and when you actually are successful and have scaled up. What I think ultimately shouldn't change that much is kind of what I think of as being the purpose of the business, right? when you hear the word pivot, what I hear is the kind of concept of the business, like its purpose for existing, didn't really pan out, right? But there are lots of things that change around how do you go to market? Exactly what should the product be versus not be? What people do you need on the team to be successful? How should your branding look and feel, right? Those are things that ultimately are pretty mutable. But I think whether you're successful or not, it's kind of a question of does the purpose of the business really, does it make sense? And so distinguishing as an entrepreneur between like, why do I exist? Why am I working on the problem? Is it a real problem that needs to be solved versus some of the more market strategy and tactical things, which are ultimately ones that you need to iterate through to figure out what's going to work. That's a distinction that's really important to make. And I certainly have seen entrepreneurs who get those things confused, right? Mm-hmm. They think that they have product market fit, but they realize that their go-to-market plan doesn't make any sense. Or they think they have a product that will be relevant in a huge market, but they are too narrow in terms of thinking about what that product ought to include in order to allow them to scale. Those are real mistakes, but ultimately they're ones that if you take kind of a test and learn mindset to, and if you're very disciplined, I think you can power through.
Got it. All right, that's very interesting. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are starting something, and it sounds really great on paper, and even they have validated that by generating demand, even in the beginning, seems like it's really a valid idea, and then they start pursuing it, and then a year or two into it, maybe they even get funding, but then it just doesn't work out for some reason.
Yeah.
And it might be that what they thought or what initially generated the demand was not actually what the people expected, or a variety of reasons.
And markets change, right?
Right.
The data that I've seen would suggest that for companies who receive, late seed or Series A funding, the failure rate, meaning they don't ultimately return investment capital, is still 70% plus, meaning more than 2/3 of businesses who get to that phase ultimately don't return the capital invested in them. Right. And so I don't think about it as, why do companies fail? Rather, I think about what makes companies who succeed succeed.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate reality, but it's just, one of those you got to pick yourself up and keep moving, is most don't work out for whatever reason. And so I do think the burden of proof on, is it a big enough idea in a big enough market with a good enough team, a good enough go-to-market, and the right approach to product, and access to capital and other resources you need. I mean, you have to get a lot of things right. And it's not to say you have to get everything right. We certainly, building up ELN and the funding circle, got a lot of things wrong, right? Yeah. We made a lot of mistakes. Fortunately, none of them, at least as of yet, have been mortal mistakes, right? We've been able to fix things as we've gone along. But yeah, that's our thing.
That's really cool. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit and just to ask you, was there a moment, or actually, was there a person that kind of really influenced you, especially, I guess, in the beginning of your career, or even a person in general in your life that really shaped, who shaped who you are? Of course, everybody shapes us, but a really significant person, or maybe even, it could be a person, or it could be a book, so it's like another person through that channel. Some kind of figure in your life.
I mean, I would point to a number of influences on the personal front. I mean, going back to my roots, I think the way my parents raised my sister and me was, number one, be very intellectually curious, right? I would say that I was very self-directed from an early age because they kind of set the parameters and allowed me to do that. They threw a lot of content at me and kind of saw what stuck. They were very supportive of me, kind of regardless of what it is that I wanted to do. They just wanted me to find something I was passionate about and pursue it. In addition to that, my grandparents on both sides, but I particularly call out my dad's parents, who were career scientists, were just deeply intellectually curious. And I think a lot of kind of my early exposure to them when I was a little kid, informed my curiosity that then has kind of stayed with me, through the course of my life. And honestly, I think that being curious is just such if you can raise curious children, if you can be curious yourself, it's something you all ought to aspire to, because it just makes the life so much more interesting given its richness. So that'd be one kind of foundational. And then on the business front, once I'd kind of made the fork into evil business land, I would say that I was particularly inspired by the series of entrepreneurs who I worked with and for early on in my career. And so, the consulting firm was co-founded and run by a guy named Canner, who I'm still touch with, and I still think the world of, and saw how he built and ran that business, and it was just great and eye-opening to see. I then worked for another entrepreneur, Barry Silbert at Second Market, who has done incredibly well as an entrepreneur, and I just think is an inspiration. And I forgot, in between that, I worked for Larry Wilson, who was the insurance entrepreneur who I mentioned before. And Larry, at that point was 40-ish years beyond me in terms of career experience, but still willing to invest in and develop me. And I learned a tremendous amount from him. He had a very thoughtful and earthy way of expressing things, and was able to take a lot of complexity and distill it down. He was just a terrific operator and really, really good at building great teams. So I pointed to the entrepreneurs I worked with early on. Those were people who ultimately inspired me and kind of made me better just by what they taught me.
That's awesome. So from what I hear, is really important actually to have people in your life that you don't have to reinvent the wheel by yourself. You can actually really learn from others. And some people don't have access to those great entrepreneurs. You might have had the chance to work closely with them. What would you do, let's say, if you just had a regular job and didn't have like that one-on-one personal relationship with the mentors, but just stepping out, like not everybody has like that privilege.
Yeah.
What would you recommend those people do?
Well, this is where getting real world entrepreneurial experience, even if you're not the founder, I think is incredibly valuable. And so my advice to someone who wants to build a scaled up technology enabled company of any sort, regardless of what the domain is, could be in financial services, could be in healthcare, could be enterprise, doesn't matter. Whatever the domain they're passionate about, go find the top 6 or 7, emerging, interesting companies that are growing quickly and going through all of the wonderful and painful things that come with that phase of development, and find a job, get in there, right? And the reality is, if you go in and get in there and prove yourself, and wherever you start, you will, if you do well, have a lot of opportunity. And even if you stay in the same job for several years, totally fine, right? You learn a lot, not only about that job, but also how do companies like that work? Yeah. And so when you're actually ready to then go and do your own thing, your pattern recognition, your ability to move quickly and have confidence in your decisions, not to mention the quality of your decision making, is just going to be higher, right? You're never going to get 100% of the way there, right? Like any leader who is worth their salt, I think, would admit they get it wrong almost as often probably as they get it right. But there is just something around, knowing which decisions really matter, getting the big ones right, and all the other stuff, moving reasonably quickly and being consistent in terms of how you approach things.
Yeah, that sounds really reasonable, actually. Great advice. Thank you. The other question I have is really about any kind of books that I think we talked about it a little bit over a break at some point, but what are the books that also influenced you? Something that must read that's really either just inspirational or you really expand your mind just by reading some of them. Not necessarily business. It could be any book that you just think that is so valuable for anyone.
Gosh, I mean, I'm a voracious reader. I probably read 30 to 50 books a year. When I have my library is overflowing at this point. So to be honest, I would have a hard time pointing to one book. I would say that reading and being open-minded and stretching how you think about things is incredibly helpful. In general, I'm pretty skeptical of business books, if I were to be really honest. I do think that sometimes biographies can be a really powerful way to see kind of the span of someone's life and career. And so I've been inspired by and really enjoyed and gotten a lot out of biographies of political leaders and also, frankly, of business leaders. I mean, Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs is a classic, I think, of business biography. Not to say that he gets everything right. I'm sure he got some of the details wrong, but I think he paints a complex picture of a complex entrepreneur, right? And I think anyone who, wants to enrich their life can read that and, contrast it to, any number of other good biographies and get a great deal out of it. I would say, if you're a military historian buff, Winston Churchill's autobiographical series about the Second World War, I found to be incredibly moving and powerful, just because he goes through in pretty, gritty detail all the decisions that, he and his cabinet made from before the war all the way through. And, he was living kind of the firsthand consequences of decision making with limited information and real consequences. if you think running a business is hard, try running a country during a period of crisis, right?
Absolutely.
So I do think there's something around those sorts of novels. On the personal front, I'm a big fan of mountaineering and outdoors activities, and so stories of outdoor adventure and exploration I think are very powerful. I was inspired early on by the stories around Ernest Shackleton. So if you're into that sort of thing, there are a bunch of Shackleton books, and including one by Frank Worsley, who was his first mate, about the boat expedition that I think is really worth a read for anyone. So I think those would be the sorts of things I'd point you to.
Wonderful. So it sounds just keep reading, keep expanding your mind.
Reading.
Yeah.
Biography.
It doesn't actually really matter what it is. It's what moves you, what works for you.
I think that, look, if you're reading reading romance novels, that's probably less relevant. It's probably less relevant for entrepreneurship than many other things.
Yeah.
But I think you can find great books in the sciences. You can find great books that are biographical or autobiographical. You can find great economics books if you want to understand the way markets work. Those are fantastic. I've done a lot of, more recently, I've been very curious about human cognition. It's been something I've been really curious about for a long time. I mean, Daniel Kahneman's, Thinking Fast and Slow, absolutely worth a read. I actually did a teaching thing here at Funding Circle for a number of years about how to make fast decisions.
Right,
and
I remember
it was
that.
very much informed by some of the work that Kahneman and others have done. So I guess what I'd say is, again, there's a lot of great stuff out there. Keep reading, follow your passions. If you're running into something in your life or in your business where you're like, I want to learn more about this, and or why isn't this working the way I think it should work?
Right.
I guarantee you there's a great book out there that'll help you kind of navigate through that.
Got it. All right. So now that we've talked a lot about the successes and what shaped you, I was also wondering, were there moments of failure, or you felt like it was a moment of failure that actually really defined your either future or a certain behavior? That was a turning point at some point as well, but you actually still treat that as a moment of a downfall or
So I'm pretty sure it was a Marissa Mayer quote. Marissa Mayer, who was the former CEO of Yahoo, that went something like, "You only fail if you stop moving." And I kind of think of failure that way, right? Failure is when you give up, right? And there certainly are business and investment failures I've had, but I don't think of them as, I guess I do think of them as business and commercial failures, but I don't think of them as personal failures, right? I think for me, the bar on personal failures are, do I live to my own kind of code, right?
Yeah.
Do I, act the way I would want to think I'd act over the course of my life and my career?
Thinking back.
Thinking back, right?
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that, we all have only a limited amount of time on this earth, and so to the extent that you can, at the end of your career and life, look back and not have major regrets, I think that's kind of a life well lived. And it really comes down to, how do you spend your time? Who do you spend with it? Who do you spend your time with? Who do you invest in? And ultimately, kind of what's our legacy, right? I think that's kind of the existential question we all have as humans is, how do we leave the earth as a better place or not? And there's so many different ways that can play out, right? Ranging from building companies and developing people all the way through, researching, next cure to disease, to many, many other things, right? There are so many different good ways of living your life, and it's just about doing that. Along the way, you're gonna have setbacks, right? For me, I've made dumb investments, plenty of them, things where I've lost money. I have made poor business decisions that have had real consequences. Certainly have learned from those, but I don't look at those as being failures per se. I just view them as being mistakes.
Yeah, beautiful. I love this outlook, because a lot of people are discouraged by things that happen because they did something and then they stop themselves before they even start doing anything else. So I think it's really important to think the way you do, that no matter what happens, that's just an outcome. It's a result. It's not necessarily, doesn't mean that you failed, doesn't mean that you now should not do anything. So I really like the way you put it, because it's very powerful in this thinking.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people while at it can't really think that, oh, you know what, that's not a failure, it's just a mistake and it's just a result.
Yeah.
is there like, is you actually consciously make this and like, nope, this is not a failure, or is it automatic that it's fine, it's not a problem,
Well,
we'll deal with that?
I think there are two points I'd make, and this is easier said than done. I certainly, in the moment, have thought I'm a failure, or this is going to be a failure, for sure, right? I think we all have that, that self-doubt, right? Imposter syndrome, whatever you want to call it. I do think, though, if you can always be thinking, what is in my control versus what's out of my control, and if you have genuinely done everything that's within your control to influence the outcome in a good way, then I think it's difficult to say it's failed, right? Or you failed. The company may have failed, the project may fail, but you've done everything you can to get it to the best possible place. And I think that's a really important difference. I think a lot of people face adversity and they just shut down.
Yeah, or they start thinking, what should I have done? And then that just becomes a loop that you don't want to go into.
You end up getting into into a bad place quickly, and that's a dangerous rabbit hole. When things go wrong, having the mindset of, okay, what do we do next? How do we move forward from here? And of course, at the right moment, pick yourself up, reflect on how you ended up making a bad decision, either you individually or the collective that you're part of. How did you end up in that bad place? But the most important thing, the first important thing, get out of it. Right? Figure out how do you get out of that bad situation, and if you can kind of do that, I ultimately think you'll end up having a much more resilient organization and personal psychology.
Right. No, I love it. Thank you so much for saying that. I think that totally resonates with me and something that we should all work on as human beings, not just business leaders. And I think the last really question is, now that you've stepped down and then it frees up some of your time, I'm sure you took it for yourself, but is there something that you're working on right now? What is that?
So I'll forever be invested in Funding Circle success, because I believe that what we're doing here in terms of providing capital for small businesses who need it is just it's a good thing. It's something that the world needs, and I think we have the opportunity to do it globally. At the same time, I was ready to transition for a variety of reasons. Some of them, frankly, very personal. I was ready for a break and kind of realized that, and I was also ready to start scratching at a different problem. I think the team here has done just a wonderful job of getting the business to where it is, and I'm really excited to see what's next for the company. On my front, I plan to stay in financial services writ large, and I am indeed scratching at a new idea, which I'll hopefully be able to share more about sometime next year.
That's exciting. I love that a lot of people want to retire. They're like, all right, now I've built my success and now I can just relax.
I don't know what I do with my time.
Yeah.
Apparently I'm a masochist, because I actually like this stuff.
Yeah, I think someone like you definitely doesn't want to just stop because they've already achieved something. Great mind, just keep moving.
Too kind. It's I do think there's something. Once you've built something, it kind of becomes a little addictive, right?
Yeah.
And you have a little bit of restlessness around keeping doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, for sharing all of the insights, all of your learnings. I think it was really valuable. I really appreciate your time.
Likewise. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.